Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. Earlier this year, Cornell created the Presidential Task Force on Institutional Voice to examine whether and how the university should speak out on national events. The task force created a draft report that was released to the community last month, outlining principles and providing suggestions to guide the president, the provost, deans, academic departments, faculty members, and others. The task force was co-chaired by Cornell Law School Dean Jens Ohlin and Deputy Provost Avery. Today, we're fortunate enough to have Dean Ohlin here to discuss these important issues with us. My name is Nelson Tebbe. I'm a professor in the law school, and I'm very happy to welcome Dean Ohlin. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us to discuss these important issues.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Viewers, we'll take your questions throughout our discussion, so please submit them in the chat. And there are links available to the draft report of the committee, the October update, and also a link to provide feedback on the report. We encourage everyone to do that. So why don't we just start in a very basic way by getting a sense of the subject matter of the report. What exactly is institutional voice?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great place to start, because I think for some of us who are really deep into this question, we take it for granted what that phrase means, but for others who are less focused on it, it might seem like an odd turn of phrase. Institutional voice is meant to refer to how the university as an institution speaks. What it means for the university to speak, and all of the questions surrounding, when and how and who should exercise who and how the institution should exercise that voice. So it's really, I think, a reference to the collective voice of the university as such, separate from the voices of the individuals that make up the university. Now that's a very, very complicated question because the university is a complex entity, right? It's not a building or just a set of individuals, right? It's this corporate entity, but a very special and impressive one. So it's a corporate entity like no other, but nonetheless, I think there's a sense in which the university sometimes can and does speak as a collective institution, as a university. And institutional voice refers to that collective speech.
That's interesting. So sometimes you hear the phrase institutional neutrality used. I guess some of our peer institutions have used that phrase, and occasionally the federal government has also used it. It's conspicuous that you have not chosen to use the term neutrality. And I'm wondering what the thinking is behind the phrase institutional voice.
Yeah, so we deliberately avoided using the phrase institutional neutrality, even though in some ways I think it's a famous phrase. It's frequently associated with University of Chicago and the Chicago approach, although I think it's taken on a life of its own since then. And for many people, the phrase institutional neutrality, I think, is a helpful phrase, because it means that a university should be neutral on political or ideological questions. And in that sense, it's been helpful in sort of public discussion of these topics. But I think our committee also realized that the phrase institutional neutrality is sometimes a little bit confusing. It sometimes obscures more than it illuminates. And I'll give just like two examples where sometimes it takes things a little bit off course. So, for example, there are some situations where the university really can't be neutral. And the phrase institutional neutrality can sometimes lead people a little bit astray about that. So oftentimes the university has to decide what it's going to do. It's got to decide how it's going to invest its endowment. It's got to decide what courses it's going to let its professors teach. It's got to decide what colleges or schools it's going to operate. It has to decide how it's going to, deal with patient care at its hospitals or veterinary care for animals. And those are all decisions that it can't really escape. And so neutrality sometimes confuses that question. The other way in which I think institutional neutrality can confuse the issue is that neutrality sort of focuses on a state of mind, and really what we really want to focus on is this question of action, which is how does the university exercise its voice? And that's more of a question not of a state of mind, of a political orientation. It's more a question of, well, what should the university do? How does it make its decision about when to speak? And we really wanted to foreground that in terms of our guidance rather than focusing on this more mental question of neutrality.
How did this effort at Cornell to formulate a policy on institutional voice come about?
Yeah, it's helpful to get into that history here. So our charge came from the president and the provost in April, which is only a few months ago. And we were tasked with looking at the entire question of institutional voice, looking at when the university should speak, who should speak for the university, what principles should guide the university in determining when and how it should speak. And we were tasked with coming up with a process for conducting those conversations, holding listening sessions. We sent out a survey. We received a voluminous number of responses to our survey. We received emails. Some of them were a couple sentences long. Some of them were memoranda, 5 pages long with really detailed suggestions and analysis of this question. And we read every single one of them in pretty intense detail and then deliberated on them. But stepping back for a second, why were we given this charge? I think there was a sense that we were in really fraught territory in higher education because statements by universities had kind of gotten out of hand, and everyone was somewhat dissatisfied with the current landscape. Now, people maybe had different views about how to solve this problem. People might have been dissatisfied in different ways and contradictory ways. Some people wanted more, some people wanted less. But I think there was a broad recognition that the current framework that universities were using was not working. And there was, strangely, ironically, I think a lot of shared agreement that this is something that needed to be looked at and analyzed and thought and rethought very deeply because there was just so much dissatisfaction. Just speaking from personal experience as a dean, when statements were issued at the law school by my desk, instead of it generating enthusiasm or kind of lowering the temperature, it inevitably made people more upset rather than less upset whenever a statement was issued. So something was going wrong, and so I think that's what was the impetus behind a presidential task force to look at this question.
Well, let's look at the guidelines, the report that you've produced. It's just a draft report. I know you're still collecting comments about it and seeking to improve it. But one of its characteristics, just at a very high level of abstraction, is that it's very self-consciously kind of mission-centric.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what you mean by that. What is the philosophy of the report at a high level?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question that way, because I think that this notion of mission-centric voice was really at the heart of the report. That was really what we were trying to foreground. And in some ways, this kind of links up to your prior question about institutional neutrality. We were trying to de-emphasize neutrality and push a mission-centric conception of voice to the forefront. And in some ways, those might seem like polar opposites, but I actually think that they are somewhat complementary and actually the same idea, but just viewed from different perspectives, right? So institutional neutrality, I think, can often seem like a very negative description of what could also just be described as a mission-centric conception of voice. So neutrality says well, try and be as neutral as possible and don't talk about certain things. So it's just like very negative. And I think mission, like talking about our mission, is meant to sort of say the same thing, but on it from a more positive side of the coin. So really, the university should talk about things that are related to its mission. And when we're outside of the ambit of the university's mission, then I think we need to be more careful and more circumspect and more restrained. Now that, of course, gets into a deeper question about what the mission of the university is. There's a lot to be said there, but I'll just say one thing to get the ball rolling. Our task force was really not charged with, nor was it appropriate for us to reconceive what the mission of the university is or what the mission of Cornell is. That wasn't, I think, within our jurisdiction. It's a little bit above our pay grade, so to speak. And we were suggesting that whatever the mission of the university is, that should be the guiding principle behind the exercise of the institutional voice. It should be directly tied to the institution's mission. Now, luckily, the university already has a mission. We have a mission statement. It's a very broad mission. It's articulated on our website. It was formally adopted by the Board of Trustees. So luckily, we weren't operating in a vacuum where we had to make up what the mission is. There is already a mission. One thing I would say about the mission of the university is obviously research and teaching are really important as a core sort of feature of our mission, but research and teaching doesn't exhaust our mission. Our mission is a little bit more complicated than just research and teaching. And to just give some, good examples of that, we operate an entire hospital in New York City devoted to patient care. It's connected to research and teaching because it's a teaching hospital, it's a research hospital, but it also engages in patient care. We have a veterinary hospital that does animal clinical care on Ithaca. We're a land-grant institution that operates Cornell Cooperative Extension offices in every county in New York State doing public engagement to fulfill our land-grant mission. And all of those, I think, are very much at the core of the university's mission. And so it's actually a very, very complicated question to sort of provide a complete description of what the university's mission is.
It reminds me of the way debates have evolved around the neutrality of democratic governments. There was once a time when I think people used to like to say that liberal democracy should remain neutral as to questions of the good life. And then I think there was an evolution of that debate where people said, no, well, actually there are values that that democracies have to really sort of stick by, including the value of individual freedom itself, right? And the ability of individuals to dissent. Like that is a value. It's a value that protects pluralism rather than shutting it down. But I see a similar kind of development in the thinking, not just here at Cornell, but nationally on questions of university voice.
I think that's right.
So when someone's deciding, a leader of the university is deciding whether to exercise the capacity to speak on pressing national issues of the day, what criteria should they consider?
Yeah, so our report recommends that the university, as well as a university leader who's going to speak for the institution, like a president or a provost, should really be focused on the university's mission, values, and functions, and should consider whether or not the issue that they might be talking about would directly impact the exercise or execution of the university's values, mission, and functions. And that language, I think, of directly impacting is really at the core of our kind of recommendation or best practice that we're trying to suggest to the community. It's not enough for the issue being, tangentially related to how we exercise our affairs on campus, but really the question is, okay, is this topic something that directly impacts the execution of our mission, and therefore it's required for us to speak on, or is the connection really, really distant? I think it's rarely the case that something that you want to speak on is going to be far afield from the mission of the university. So I think a lot of the application of our recommendations is going to come down to some line drawing exercises, inevitably, in terms of how closely something is connected to the mission of the university. And that's why we used the word directly in the report, that the issue directly impacts the university's mission is really meant to suggest, all other things being equal, a really tight connection.
So it's interesting that the report, mentions this first criteria of directly affecting the university's mission, but then adds a second circumstance in which universities leaders might speak, which is if the issue that they're addressing directly affects, so again, the directness is important, but this time, background conditions that kind of make it possible for the university to function.
Yeah.
And you give some examples, I'm not quoting directly here, but it's like, the conditions of democracy in our society, the existence of free speech and so forth. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, why not just leave it at the first criteria? Why did you add the second?
Yeah, so I think this was probably the most complicated aspect of our discussions, and I think we were, trying to be thoughtful and nuanced in recognizing, sort of two essential truths here. One, we want to really limit the institution's voice to things that are happening on campus, and not get distracted by world events or national events that are really unconnected to the operation of the university. That's certainly true, and we were really motivated by this truth. But on the other hand, we were also acutely aware that the university doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? And if anything over the last year has been clear with the complexities of our negotiations with the federal government, we're embedded in a country, in a regulatory environment, in a legal environment, in a political environment, and that environment impacts our ability to get our job done in terms of research and teaching and impact. So there's no question that the background conditions of the world impact us just as they would impact anyone else, right? Laws that would impact a corporation or a private citizen impact us. Everything from immigration issues having to do with that affect our students getting visas, tax issues, grants. Those are just like three simple examples, but there would be hundreds of others. So we're subject to the conditions of the environment that we operate in, and those can impact our mission in very, very powerful ways. And we wanted to suggest that those could be legitimate moments for the university to speak. And in fact, they might even be necessary. Now, that doesn't mean that the university should run off willy-nilly and discuss everything that's related to democracy or the rule of law. But if something flowing from one of those areas really prevents the university from executing on its legitimate mission, then I think it's fair game for the university to speak about them.
It's very interesting and quite persuasive. Although I think on the question of necessity, I think the report says, if those two conditions are met or one of the two conditions are met, then it's permissible for university leaders to speak, but not required.
Yes.
Do you think there are situations in which it might be actually required?
No, I don't think it is. Although it's interesting, we received a lot of opinions on this topic, and I think we outline a series of criteria to suggest when the university can speak. And we, as you point out, note that the university is never required to speak. And I think one of the reasons why we said that is because the question of the university speaking is really a strategic question. And it should be guided by the strategy and the strategic considerations of the moment. So there are certain circumstances when the university would be well served by speaking loudly and speaking often on a particular topic. And then there's other circumstances where the university, I think, would be better advised to speak less often and more quietly. And then there might be further situations where really the best course of action strategically is just silence. And I think it's for the university to figure that out, given the particular challenge that it's facing in the moment.
I think quite closely related to that is another theme of the report, which I thought was interesting and quite admirable, which is a principle of restraint, or sometimes it's called a principle of prudence.
Yeah.
What do you see as that principle requiring? How should someone think about it when they're taking into account the more granular decisions around like whether the topic sort of fits criteria A or criteria B?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is very much related to one of your earlier questions about institutional neutrality and why not use the phrase institutional neutrality. And we sort of thought that institutional restraint provides a better guide for action than something like institutional neutrality, because institutional neutrality sounds like a state of mind, whereas institutional restraint is more like a principle to guide your action. So when you're thinking about, hey, should I speak about this or not, restraint is meant to, provide you with something very, very concrete about how you should make that decision. And I think it's to sort of suggest that there should be a thumb on the scale in favor of being careful and recognizing the special dangers associated with speaking too loudly on a topic that really is not appropriate for the university to speak on. And so I think restraint is designed to really get people to sort of think about the real costs associated with speaking too much on those questions. There's nothing magical though about that phrase restraint. I think it's a phrase that other universities have used in talking about institutional voice. But you could just as well talk about prudence or reasonable circumspection. And I think we use multiple phrases in the document. But restraint, I think, is as good as any other in terms of articulating that principle.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the possible costs of the university exercising its voice. The Calvin report, which is produced by the University of Chicago in 1967, is maybe the most famous of the statements on institutional neutrality or voice that we have. Articulates a tension between institutional speech and individual speech. So the report suggests that messaging by the university, this is the Calvin report, can risk what it calls censuring the freedom of its constituents, faculty or students or even staff. You could think of this as something like a separation of church and state principle, but for the university. Sometimes in the report, you describe this as the danger of crowding out speech. How did you grapple with that tension, and what ways in which did you seek to resolve it in the report?
Yeah. Resolve it? I'm not sure you can ever resolve the tension between individual and collective voice. And in many ways, I think that's the kind of core tension that animates this entire exercise, right? I mean, this whole thing, this whole conversation, this whole problem is about what is the relationship between the individual member of the university community and the university as such, and how does the university's voice intersect with the individual's voice? And how do we make sure that the university speaks in a way that allows those individual voices to flourish, right? Because just to step back for a second, the university is a collective that's a little bit different from a corporation or other collective, which have a different purpose in mind, right? Corporations are meant to, accomplish a particular business objective. You can think of other collectives too, like a trade union or a political party. I mean, there's lots of different collectives out there. But a university, I think, is a very special one because it's designed to bring individuals together to engage in things like research and teaching and other forms of impact like, clinical patient care. But it's meant to create these communities where there's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of conversation, right? Whether it's, scholarship, teaching in the classroom, conversations within the community, conversations between members that are inside the community and those who are on the outside of the community. But like the whole raison d'etre of the university is fostering and developing and adding nuance and sophistication to these conversations. And so I think universities have to be especially mindful of the dangers associated with the university's voice crowding out or chastening or limiting in some way the voices of individuals within the community. We want to make sure that individuals feel comfortable talking about the things they need to talk about on very difficult, contentious, messy subjects that people intensely disagree with. Now, one thing though I would hasten to add, the Calvin report, might go a little bit too far on this point, because just because a university says X or a collective says yes, doesn't mean that an individual can never disagree with it, right? So I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, because the university has spoken about something or because the collective has spoken about something that the individual then is never going to speak about it. People, I think, have to get comfortable with disagreement, right? And that's the whole point of these conversations. People oftentimes have to be even comfortable with disagreement when there's power, dynamics. Like for example, you can be, as a student or a faculty member, you could be in a group talking with 10 people and 9 people can say X and the one person has to be thoughtful and say, well, actually, I disagree, right? But all of that being said, I think there is a real concern that if a university speaks too often and too much on topics that really the individuals of the community should be talking about, that something has gone wrong in that process. And I think the Calvin report, gestures in the right direction on that point.
Yeah, the Calvin report famously says, the institution, not quoting directly, but something like, the institution is a home for critics. It is not itself a critic. But I think the reason for that is that, Calvin and the rest of the members of the committee were worried that if the university, took critical positions that could chill or silence, the voices of individual constituents in the university. At least that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, and I think that was right about that. The university should not be a critic. The only sort of footnote I would add to that is that the university does have to do certain things that I wouldn't call it being a critic, and it has to make certain decisions, right? So the university has to decide, what it's going to do in its hospital or what kind of patient care it's going to offer, right? And you don't see any glimpse of that in the Calvin report, unfortunately. The Calvin report seems to think that all a university does is research and teaching, but that's obviously not the case. And when the university does those things, it's not the university being a critic, but it's basically deciding how it's gonna operate. And some of that, to a certain extent, is just inevitable.
There's more I want to get into in the report, but first let's take a question from one of our viewers. Beth asks, what was the composition of the committee, the total number of members she's interested in, the number of members of the committee who had administrative appointments, faculty members, were there any tenure track faculty, any adjuncts, lecturers, senior lecturers, student representation? Can you speak a little bit to the composition of the committee?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the committee was faculty-led and included faculty from the Ithaca campus, from Cornell Medicine and Cornell Tech, and included a wide range of disciplines so that we would have really rich conversations. We did not have staff and we did not have students on the committee, mostly because we felt like on this question, the major constituency that we needed to engage with and to sort of bring on board with a new approach regarding institutional voice was the faculty, right? All members and all constituencies in the universities are important, but the faculty, I think, have a particularly special role. They're We have a shared governance system in the university, but faculty are considered to be I wouldn't say the owners, but they're the guiding force behind the academic and intellectual guidance of the university. So we sort of felt like we needed to bring them on board and really engage with their thoughts to figure out this question of institutional voice. And then once we did that, we could engage with staff and students and other members of the community. And we did that through listening sessions and through feedback with those groups.
And I think I'm right that some of those sessions happened before you formulated the draft report and some have happened after.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you're at a stage where you're collecting reactions to the draft report
Yep.
and revising it in light of those reactions. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to submit their reactions to the content of the report because it can influence the way the final report might be worded. So we've spoken so far about whether and what the university should say on issues of public import.
Yeah.
But a very difficult question is, who speaks for the university? How does the report address that question? I mean, obviously the president of the university can speak for the university, but does the president always speak for the university? Who else can speak for the university? What about when those same people want to speak in their individual capacities or their capacities as academic experts in a particular field? Like, how do you address those kinds of questions?
Yeah. So let's start with the president and then the provost. And then after that, we can talk a little bit about deans of colleges and schools, if you think that's a good progression. So certainly the president and the provost can speak for the university. They're the ones who have the sort of widest responsibility for the operation of the university. And as such, I think they have the capacity to speak for the university. Within that bucket, I would also place the provost for medical affairs, because we have actually two provosts. We have a provost, a general provost, and then there's the provost for medical affairs. And if it's a question that impacts the medical school and the hospital as well, then really the provost for medical affairs is one of the relevant speakers. And outside of those three individuals, although there are a lot of important members of the community with intense responsibilities, I don't think any of them can really speak for the university. The one footnote there, I suppose we would add, is that the president can always delegate this responsibility to someone, for example, a vice president for communications or university relations, who will sort of speak on behalf of the president, who speaks on behalf of the university. But outside of that context, I think the other individuals or organs are not speaking for the university as such. Now, it's true that the president or the provost could speak for themselves as individuals, but we point out in the report that the president and the provost need to be very mindful of the fact that it's very difficult for them to speak as individuals within the wider community, because their speech will be more likely than not attributed to the university. And so they should bear that in mind. The kind of space that they have to operate to speak as individuals is very, very limited because of how closely associated they are to the university. Now, if that makes sense, we can now maybe talk about the deans of the various colleges and schools. Does that seem like a good place to go next?
Yeah, I'm curious about that, and I think it's been it's been something people have been wondering about. Like, can you, as the dean of the law school, issue a statement on an issue of national import? Under what conditions should you coordinate with the university? How do we think about that?
Yeah. So what we say in the report is that deans of colleges or schools within the university, like the law school or the College of Arts and Sciences or the School of Public Policy, they cannot speak for the university because only the president and provost can speak for the university, but they can speak for their school. But we point out that they should be very restrained in exercising that collective voice on behalf of their college or school. And so really, that decision should be really tied directly to the mission of their college and school, and whether or not that question or that issue is really necessary for them to speak on, because it goes to the core of the mission of their college. Outside of that context, the dean of a college or school should not be speaking on behalf of their college. I think this is kind of a mirror image to the same issue at the university level. I mean, the president and the provost should be restrained and not speak about issues that are unrelated to the university. And in the same way, a college dean should be restrained and not speak about some national event or international event that's unrelated to the operation of their college. Now, where things get a little bit more complicated is that college deans are professors, just like other professors, and they have scholarly expertise. And they are sometimes engaged in the classroom. They might teach a class, right? They might continue to publish. They might write a book, right? Because they're scholars and they're appointed as deans because they were scholars and continue to be scholars. They might write a journal article. They might write an op-ed article that seeks to translate those scholarly insights for a wider audience. So they might write an op-ed article in the New York Times, or write a blog post summarizing one of their academic arguments. So this, I think, is a very fraught question. And what we say in the report is that when college deans seek to speak as a teacher or as a research scholar, they should be mindful of the fact that they need to emphasize that they're speaking as an individual rather than as a dean on behalf of their college. And they should be mindful of the fact that there could be, a lot of confusion about this from the audience perspective.
That seems right. The report emphasizes that individuals retain the right to speak. So faculty, staff, students, alums, that their speech is outside the scope of the report.
Yeah.
But what about the faculty acting collectively? If the faculty of the law school or the Department of English wish to get together and issue a statement, how do you think about that? What are the best practices around it? What are procedural sort of recommendations? Do they have to satisfy the two criteria? But even then, are there concerns? Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, I think there's two important parts of that question. So let me just sort of break them up slightly and just take the first kind of predicate part of your question first, where you talked about faculty or students speaking as individuals just on their own. That's something that we did not issue guidance on. And that was not within our jurisdiction, so to speak, or our charge. And I think I just want to acknowledge that it's a very, very fraught question. Oftentimes, a faculty member or a student, just an individual, right, they have the right to speak, and that can be incredibly upsetting for other people if that decision to speak is exercised unwisely, right, or someone says something shocking or upsetting. Those questions are really important, and we don't really get into that at all. And I just want to acknowledge that might be an important question for the university or for members of the community to think about. Right? Are there certain topics that are either out of bounds, or what do you do with a member of the community who says something that's shocking or upsetting? But that's not really for us to, as a task force, to address. Now, to your direct question, what about when the, groups decide to speak together? What about a group of students or a group of faculty? What if an academic department decides that it wants to, issue a statement? I think one of the things that we really highlighted in the department is that the same tension between the individual and the collective can show up here, right? So just as there's a complicated relationship between the university as a collective and individuals, even within a subunit like an academic department or an individual, there can be a tension because if the department of so-and-so issues a statement and then some member was a dissenter and didn't agree with that statement's going to get attributed to them as an individual, and that can be a very awkward and difficult position for them to be in. And we want, departments to be mindful of that. So one of the things that we recommend in the report is that one, if a department, for example, wants to issue a statement, it should be tied to its mission. It should be through robust procedures like majority voting. There should be a vote. It should be formally voted on. There should be a public explanation of what the vote is, and then also it should be important for the department to think very seriously about whether or not they could have just issued a statement with individual signatories. What value was there in terms of issuing a statement that said, oh, this is from the so-and-so department? Why not just issue a collective letter with 5 individual names associated with it, or 10 names, or 50 names, or 100 names, or whatever? Would that better achieve your communication objectives rather than attributing it to this abstract entity?
Yeah, those are tricky issues.
Yeah.
We have another question from one of our viewers. Connie wants to know, was the task force influenced by the federal government's stance on higher education?
I think it was in the background of the entire enterprise, and in the back of everyone's mind who showed up to our listening sessions or sent comments to the task force. So it was kind of the elephant in the room, or I don't know, maybe the 100-pound gorilla in the room, or whatever the right metaphor should be. But in some sense, not as helpful as you would think to answering these questions, because we were tasked with figuring out when should the university speak on an issue that's completely unrelated, right? That's the kind of deep question, like, okay, if there's an international event or a national event that's not really connected to the operation of the university, what's the impact of the university speaking, and should it speak? Whatever you think about what's going on at the university and its relationship with the federal government and how it should handle that, there's no question that we were very directly impacted by, our federal grants, right, being terminated and being suspended. So there's no question that that is something that's directly impacting the execution of the university's mission. And that, in some sense, is a kind of an easy question and doesn't really help you answer the hard questions, which is, okay, well, if there's an international event going on that's unconnected to the university's mission, how should we approach our voice in that context?
One value that's been prominent in national debates, but also here at Cornell, I'm sure at every university, has been the question of academic freedom.
Yeah.
Is that related to questions of institutional voice? When you contemplate like members of a particular department getting together and issuing a statement on questions of the day, that seems like maybe a little bit more closely related to academic freedom than a decision by the president of the university to speak on a national issue.
Yeah.
I mean, is that how you thought about it, or did questions of academic freedom come into the discussion?
In one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. So I'll just sort of circle back to what I said before about really not sort of addressing when individuals can or should use their individual voice, right? So there's a question there about, sort of academic freedom of individuals, and, is statement X by Professor X in location Y, right, protected by academic freedom? We weren't really tasked with answering that very tricky and difficult question. So we were not looking at academic freedom in that context. But we were really focused on academic freedom in the kind of broader sense, which is, well, what are the conditions in the community that will ensure that everyone feels as comfortable as possible exercising their individual voice, and I suppose exercising their academic freedom, to make sure that those conversations are as robust and as fluid and as free as possible. So, I think one of the language that we use in the report is that on matters unconnected to the university's mission, the voice of the institution should recede into the background, and the voices of the individuals should rise to the surface as they exercise their freedom of speech. And I suppose you could describe that as an issue of academic freedom.
Mm. You know, Cornell is not the only university that's facing these kinds of questions and pressures.
Yeah.
Many of our peers have also addressed questions of institutional voice in recent years. And I'm wondering, I think the Cornell report is, I'm biased, but maybe the finest of the lot. But I'm curious, did you look at these other examples, and how did the committee sort of gain inspiration from them or depart from models from our peers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we looked at all of them. Honestly, we cataloged all of them. We read every single report from all of our peers. We paid special attention, obviously, to the Calvin report, which, as you said, was issued by Chicago in 1967. But there's been a flurry of other reports issued by our peers just in the last, 24 to 36 months. And we looked at all of them. And I suppose you could, we thought a lot about all of the similarities and then some of the differences. So if you just focus on the similarities, there's a remarkable amount of shared agreement between them. There's a kind of core that shows up in all of the approaches, which I think goes back to something I said at the very beginning, which is that there's a kind of shared recognition that the way a lot of universities were operating before in terms of exercising their institutional voice was not helpful. It wasn't working. And so I think you see that in report after report is a desire to either restrain the institution or to be a little bit more neutral, or just to do something, right, to sort of get out of the way of the individual members of the community maybe fighting these things out themselves. So that's the kind of shared core that shows up in almost every one of these reports. Now, what's different between them is the language is different, the concepts are different, the tests are different, but I also think that it's not just the kind of technical details that are different. Like, each one of these reports gets to its conclusion in a slightly different way. And I think one of the things we were trying to accomplish in our report was get to a set of principles and recommendations that felt very closely connected to Cornell specifically, right? This isn't just about institutional voice for the abstract university. This is institutional voice for Cornell University. And Cornell is a very distinct academic institution. We were founded by Ezra Cornell and A.D. White. We're the land-grant institution for New York State. We believe very firmly in the principle of any person, any study. The way that mission has played out is very specific and unique. And we're not Harvard, we're not Chicago, we're not Dartmouth, we're not Berkeley, we're not UCLA, we're Cornell. And we wanted to, I think, produce a report and a principle that was faithful to that, because ultimately it's our community that's going to be using these principles and guided by them, and it's only going to work if this is something that's really springs up from the common experience of the community. And that's one of the reasons why we focused on the mission-centric conception of institutional voice. Like, what's the mission of Cornell? Well, part of the mission is to be a place where found an institution where any person could receive instruction in any study. And that's really kind of essential to what Cornell does. And we wanted to not just gesture in that direction, but actually lean into that and use that as an explanation for how we exercise our institutional voice.
I'm tempted to leave it there because it's such a stirring depiction of what you were up to. But there's one last question from our viewers. Daryl wants to know about the board, which I guess we haven't spoken about. The board, did you speak about the board's role or individual board members in trying to influence institutional positions?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, and I think we could do a whole separate hour just on on that. So there's a sense in which the Board of Trustees is not discussed in the report more extensively, in part because I think it's clearly the case that the board has legal authority over the operation of the institution, right? The board is the power center, and it's the promulgator of the rules and policies. It's not just the president and provost serve at the pleasure of the board, but all of the policies that exist at the institution are enacted formally as a legal matter by the board. So the board has this kind of ultimate authority and kind of centralized authority, which it then delegates out to all of the actors within the university. And the board doesn't interfere with that because that would be antithetical to the academic enterprise. But there's a sense in which they, of course, have the authority to speak for the institution because they have the ability to regulate the institution. That being said, the Board of Trustees, I think, is also subject to the same principle of institutional restraint. And my sense is that the board really would see itself in the same position as the president and the provost. So I mean, I don't want to speak for the board now, but I think the board would find an approach of institutional restraint to be ultimately helpful because they themselves see that it's problematic if the board's voice were to use up the oxygen in the room so that the individuals in the community don't have the space to speak as freely as they want. And so in some sense, I think they're in a very similar position to the president and the provost.
Yeah. Well, this has been very interesting, super helpful. I'm sure every member of the Cornell community is grateful to you and the other members of the committee or task force.
Task force
For the work that you put into this hugely important topic. And thanks for joining us today and talking about this.
Thank you, Nelson. Great questions. Really appreciate it.